When taking a closer look at the lakes along Egypt's border, there are several bodies of water proposed by those using the Egyptian approach for the Exodus sea crossing.
If we're talking at this point about a particular lake, there's Lake Menzala that is way up north, and I know of people who take that view. Then there is the Bala Lakes. It's a cluster of lakes that I know people who take that view. Then here's the Timsa area. There are two Bitter Lakes. I know of people who have taken the Bitter Lakes, and then a little bit further south, you actually come to the actual Gulf of Suez.
And that was a real popular understanding for centuries.
Yes, it was. It was, and there are still people. I know of one very good scholar, evangelical scholar, who continues to take the view of actual Suez. But if any of those, whether it's Menzala, Bala, Timsa, Bitter, or Suez, any one of the five of those options qualify for a view that sees it happening adjacent to Egypt, on the west of Sinai, close in.
There's one other lake that's been proposed, Lake Serbonus, which lies up the coast of the Mediterranean. In fact, this was the sea of the Exodus for German Egyptologist Heinrich Breusch, who first popularized the shift to the shallow reed lakes in the late 1800s. However, this view has fallen from favor, mainly due to the fact that geological studies have shown that Lake Serbonus did not yet exist at the time of the Exodus, because the sandbars that formed the lake didn't develop until long afterward.
This was the prototype reed sea theory. We look at what I consider fallacies in the geographical reasoning and the use of Scripture, and yet this was a prototype theory. Somewhat later, Alan Gardner proposed a sea crossing at Lake Menzala. This map is overlaid, the satellite image. This is the shore of the Mediterranean here, Lake Menzala. Gardner proposed an exodus route through this part of Lake Menzala, and he also linked the Hebrew Suph with the Egyptian Tufi, referring to papyrus.
And I've done lots of interviews where this has come up, the Tufi connection.
And so the ecological idea is that we have to put Yam Suph, the sea crossing, in a fresh body of water where papyrus could grow, if you're going to match that thinking.
Because of the word
Tufi, meaning papyrus,
right.
overlaid on Suph. But ironically, Lake Menzala is a salty body of water, and papyrus doesn't grow there.
Just
so
a technical problem.
He perceived that perhaps it grew there at the time of the Exodus, but as we'll see in a minute, Lake Menzala didn't even exist at the time of the Exodus. And it's so ironic that he would stake a whole theory on crossing a body of water that didn't even exist 3,500 years ago.
Well, and what happens too is that, I mean, I've referenced Gardner, at different times in the films because he was a genius.
Yes.
But even so, there's a lot of science that people didn't know about, and for example, the shoreline and how things changed, right?
Exactly.
When you get into discussions about the route, one thing we need to remember is the conditions of ancient times. So if we talk about the Exodus, we look at geography today. Is the geography today the same as it was during the back 3,500 years ago?
The geography of the Eastern Nile Delta has changed quite a bit. The problem is that the Nile Delta has prograded outward. It has gone outward because of the deposit of sediment from the Nile River. And so that has drastically changed the Eastern Nile Delta. The watercourses have changed. There's been subsidence of the delta and also deposition of sandbars on the outside of it. So a lot of things are different. And one of the hardest parts here was reconstructing exactly what the Eastern Nile Delta looked like in 1250 BC.
So basically what you're saying, if we simplify that, is that as the delta flowed, it brought a lot more dirt or earth, and it extended itself, right? And the land extended itself, is that what happened?
Yes. The Nile Delta has progressed outward, and the land has extended outwards into the Mediterranean Sea, and so what we observe there now is not the case that it was during the 3,000 years ago. So that's obviously been a challenge. There's old maps around, and so you can kind of piece these things together. There's sediment cores, but it is conjecture. And so I am doing the best I can using all the sources I can find to piece together what it looked like during the time of the Exodus.
I wanted to start with perhaps the leading Near Egypt theory, the Bala Lake system, which once existed in the northeast corner of the Nile Delta.
How big do you think this sea area was?
It's quite a large lake system. I would say it's about 20 miles in length altogether. But it would have been in little pockets. That's why we call it the Bala Lake system. It's not one lake, it's a series of lakes, but it was surrounded by reeds.
What are we looking at right here? What is this?
Well, this is a satellite image, or a couple of satellite images from the 1960s. These were spy satellite images that were declassified in the 1990s. So now anyone can purchase these from the United States Geological Survey, but they're black and white images that were used for gathering intelligence. It gives us a glimpse of the land 30, 40 years ago. Now this area is covered with agricultural projects, and you wouldn't be able to reconstruct the ancient geography using modern satellite imagery like you can with this older satellite imagery.
What is it now up here? Is it land?
This is all land now. It's very swampy and muddy, but the Plusiac Nile built out beyond the coastline after the Bronze Age up through Roman times.
So the geography changed quite a bit from the Bible times.
Extremely. So if you want to look at a Bible map, forget the ones in the back of the Bible, because you have to consider the changes that have taken place. This was the coast. Here's an ancient lagoon, which I refer to as a paleo lagoon, and we've discovered a channel of probably Nilotic affinity that flowed right into the paleo lagoon. I can show you a picture here where you can see this gray material. That's mud. This used to be a wetland deposit. It's actually this little bullseye here.
So I understood that you took boring samples and you went down and you sampled this area?
We did some of that, but it was possible just to measure the stratigraphy that was in these open ditches that were created for the agricultural project. So we did some of that kind of traditional probe type of boring, but we also just mapped the canals. So we create this map, which is a better Bible map, because now it has the Mediterranean coast at that time. Here's the dune ridge, here's the Paleo Lagoon, here are some of the river channels that had been previously discovered. We discovered one through here, and it was marshy and wet. There was a thriving, fishing and even wine industry, I believe.
There is disagreement over which of the lakes existed at the time of the Exodus and what condition they would have been in at that time. This is complicated by the fact that opinions about when the Exodus occurred can differ by centuries.
Where you see the white on this map is where you have sand or land.
Professors Hoffmeyer and Mosher believe that even at the late Exodus date around 1250 BC, Lake Manzala did not yet exist in this area.
This is a schematic of what the area looked like.
In contrast, Carl Drews believes the Nile Delta had built out far enough by that time to form the beginnings of what would become Lake Manzala, just outside the so-called Paleo Lagoon. He calls this emerging area Lake Tanis.
In late Bronze, or in the Bronze Age, which would have been the Ramesside time, this was the Mediterranean coast. So there's a lot of water out here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. You can see the ancient dunes that were along the coastline here. And then you can see an old lagoon, a Paleo Lagoon that was set behind. There would have been some kind of tidal inlet here.
I know that they have a map where they were showing that the Mediterranean came down further. And so that would Lake Manzala have even existed in the time period of the Exodus? And I think that was a question that I had.
I have read Hoffmeyer and Mosher's discussion of why they think that was an area of the Mediterranean. They even label it as open sea. They say that they were convinced that the sea came up to here, but I do not see in their report any notice of the time period at which it was open sea. We know this area was changing quite rapidly. So I do not agree with their idea that that was open sea. You cannot have that kind of open sea when you have a lot of sediment coming from the delta and this alongshore drift working the sediment toward the east. So there had to be some sort of shingle beach or a coastal barrier, a sandbar there, which blocked the access from the Mediterranean from these coastal lagoons there. That's the way it is now, and even to this day you can see the coastal or longshore drift happening there, and these sandbars working their way across the open areas there and creating a lagoon along the front of the Nile Delta.
As we probed in the area, I was surprised not to find as much mud as I would have expected. This is what I expected to see everywhere, mud caked with shells. But this kind of sediment wasn't as abundant as I thought.
It pertains to a true sea.
Glenn Fritz thinks the abundance of sand and the limited amount of silt or mud found here shows that this backwater area was only covered by water for a few centuries, around the time of Ramesses, as the Nile Delta built outward, but not in the earlier Middle Kingdom, where he dates the Exodus.
I don't favor the Bala Lake because I'm not sure it existed. Geologically, there is a lot of evidence that it did not exist.
At the time of the Exodus.
At the time of the Exodus. And if it did exist, it was an ephemeral body of water filled periodically by overflow from the Pelusian branch of the Nile.
Fritz also doubts whether a temporary lake formed during the annual floods, only to dry up during the dry season, would qualify for being called a sea, or a yam, as in the biblical name Yam Suph. There's also a problem with the prevalence of salt water in the area.
The Delta coastline was 22 miles further inland because it hadn't been built out by the silting process of the annual flooding. There were few areas in this region suited to the envisioned Sea of Reeds, ecologically in terms of fresh water, environments that could support papyrus or reeds. Was a problem.
Some people have wondered, were all the lakes really there at the time of the Exodus?
The answer is yes and no. The reason that I can say yes is that, for example, I know that the Bitter Lakes, both of them, were there. They're actually attested in literature. The lake that I use,
Lake Timsah?
Timsah Lake was there because it's actually recited in literature. There's no question about it. The Bala Lakes were there, but I'm not familiar with actual Egyptian or Canaanite literature that make mention of the Bala Lakes in using Egyptian terms. Oh, and Lake Menzala was there. So the Bitter Lakes had to be there because they're actually attested. In fact, they're referred to as Bitter Lakes in classical literature. Lake Timsah was there. Lake Menzala was there. My suspicion is that Bala Lakes was there, but I can't tell you if they are tested.
In his book, The Lost Sea of the Exodus, Glenn Fritz goes into depth on the conditions of these lakes in the past and questions exactly what these ancient references were referring to.
Another popular theory is crossing one of the lakes in the isthmus, in this case the Bitter Lakes. Of course, these lakes were filled in the 1860s when the Suez Canal was under construction, and it was a big news item, the millions of gallons of water that went into these lakes when they finally opened the locks and the dams to let the water flow. Actually, prior to the Suez Canal, the isthmus was dry. There were salt pans in some low-lying areas here, but the isthmus was dry, and going back to Pliny, in the classical period, it's described as desert.
Where do you think that the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea was?
I think it took place here, actually on the northern shore of the Great Bitter Lake. I've been talking to Sir Colin Humphreys about his wind set-down effect, which he places over here, pretty much the equivalent place on the northern shore of the Aqaba Gulf. I'm putting it here on the Great Bitter Lake. I think in earlier times the isthmus was far less silted up than it is now. A lot of silt has come down and filled it up and blown in from the desert as well. And it seems that tidally and seasonally the Great and the Lesser Bitter Lakes were connected with the Suez Gulf. And then of course you had encroachment coming in here seasonally and tidally from the Mediterranean Sea.
What about other places like the Bitter Lakes? When we look at other locations, because some people have suggested right up north of the Suez is the Bitter Lakes right there, isn't it? In fact, those Bitter Lakes were kind of, they didn't look like that back 3,500 years ago. Were they more pockets of water, and they were sort of brought together through the canal?
I've seen old maps which say that the Bitter Lakes were not even filled with water during the time of the Exodus, because they are dry completely in the middle of the desert, and unless you have something that drains into them, they'll be dry.
What was the biblical or Hebrew name of the sea that was crossed?
Well, the name is Yam Suph, and there's a lot of debate about it, whether it means Sea of Reeds or the End Sea. I prefer Yam Suph, which means the End Sea, or the sea at the end of the world. This is a very mysterious sea to the ancients. They knew everything about the Mediterranean. They didn't know really where this went or what it was for. But nonetheless, it doesn't really matter, because...
So do you think this was the Yam Suph, or do you think that Bitter Lakes were a part of it?
I think they were tidally connected and seasonally connected. You know, in the inundation of the Nile, before we had the Aswan Dam, water would flood through here during the inundation and run into the isthmus. It doesn't really happen anymore. They've got a controlled sweetwater canal, you know, which brings sweet water all the way down to the Suez port here. But this was seasonally very, very wet in the isthmus there.
Because it came from Africa, and all of this water would just pour out from Central Africa throughout here.
So it would fill up parts of the isthmus, and then if you had a high tide coming in up here from through the shaft in the Shaluf, and you had the tide come out through here, you'd have water coming from both directions.
There are older maps that show a short extension here of this Gulf of Suez northward. I looked up a lot of research and what I could find about the global sea levels, and the consensus seems to be that the sea levels were about 8 inches lower 3,000 years ago. So not a whole lot of difference. It pretty much looked like it does now. I don't see evidence for a long extension of the Gulf going northward here to the Bitter Lakes.
The fundamental control of that is the ice that is at the north and the south poles. As the glaciers melt, as the conditions warm, as is what is happening right now, then more fresh water pours into the ocean and the sea level goes up. And that's what we're experiencing right now. And in fact, several tropical countries, which are island countries with very low-lying island structure, are in fact threatened. For example, Tuvalu in the Western Pacific is actually being inundated by sea level rise right now. At the same time, we must remember that we need to look at the history of the sea level in the Red Sea. Certainly, the sea level is not the same now as it was 1,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago. And we know for sure that the sea level now is higher.
Other than extremely high flood years, it seems the only way to get water into the Bitter Lakes was through canals. However, historical records indicate that while canals may have existed in the north at the time of the Exodus, they were only built in the south during the Persian and Greek periods, 1,000 years after the Exodus.
The vestige of this ancient canal, it ran the whole way from the Mediterranean Sea as far south as Timsa Lake. You see the course of it right here. It goes from here right into Bala Lakes, goes through the Bala Lakes, comes out right here, and goes the whole way to Timsa Lake. So, if they are going in this direction, they're going to have to navigate Timsa Lake and the canal. Now, you'll notice that I made my line go just a little bit south of the road. My thought, and it's nothing more, at this point now I'm going to get into supposition, because I don't know, we don't have any evidence. But I'm thinking, well, had they gone down like this and out, they could have avoided this whole canal system.
The other big question is, whichever of these lakes may have existed, how deep might they have been?
Well, according to the text, it says that all of Pharaoh's army, all of his chariots and all the chariots in the land were destroyed in this particular location as they pursued. And then they wandered in the wilderness afterwards. Now, is this a very deep, would this have been a very deep sea, according to some of the references in the scriptures?
Go back and show you another picture here. This is an image of the Bala Lake area today, and I'm standing here on an old levee kind of man-made structure, and I'm looking out across it. But we did a survey off of the shoreline with our total station, our surveying equipment, and just going about 300 meters from the shoreline down into the depression, we got about 6 meters of elevation difference. So it probably got as much as 10, maybe even 12 meters deep in some places. I think it gets very close to sea level even today. So it was at times a sizable lake. I think that sometimes it may have been much drier. I also found evidence of a river running through it. So it may have been, for much of the time, a wetland with lots of small lakes or ponds, but during the wet season, it may have filled in to a more substantial body of water.
Professor Beitzel gives a more conservative figure for the general depth of the lakes.
Like all of these lakes, it's probably 10 to 15 feet deep. It's not deep water. It's mostly salt water. Papyrus, depending upon the species of papyrus that may have existed, what exists in Egypt, could tolerate both fresh water and salt water that was not extremely salinated. Extreme salination, like some forms of ocean water, would probably be problematic. But to have papyrus grow, the water has to be calm and the water has to be shallow. So any of these lakes would fit that.
One crucial factor is the timing of the yearly Nile flood. The summer monsoons in Ethiopia meant that the Nile crested at the end of summer, peaking in late August. However, the exodus happened in the spring of the year, when the Nile waters were at their lowest.
Forced labor was typical for ancient Egypt because otherwise they couldn't keep the Nile branches going because the Nile silt would block them, and then horrible accidents would happen. The Nile would search a new bed and all these towns would be without water. So as long as a strong government in Egypt reigned, every year thousands of farmers were recruited to clear out in the spring when the water was very low. It was a period of drought to clear out the Nile branches. In this way you can keep the Nile branches stable.
Found this spot here.
Carl Drews uses observations of the current situation as the basis for his estimate of ancient conditions.
Right now, the lakes here are about 2 meters, maybe 1.5 meters deep. So when you're publishing a peer-reviewed paper, you have to have some basis for what you claim. So I just said, let's use the present depth of these lakes and lagoons, and we're going to make this 2 meters. So that's roughly the depth. That's 2 meters is enough to drown an adult male. So that depth of 2 meters fits the definition of somebody drowning, especially if they can't swim very well with their armor on. It's also the present depth of these lagoons here. So there's a decent basis for thinking about 2 meters deep.
I know that when we looked at Cecil B. DeMille's work, he had a spectacular miracle on screen. Now he's making a movie, but he did a lot of research. Now it's interesting that he put the crossing up in the northern part as well.
Did he?
Yeah, he did. I think when he talked about it, he had it, I think, happening up in this area. And but yet he had a very spectacular miracle.
But you know what's up there? It's like less than 1 meter of it's so flat, like all the way through there. The Bala Lakes is very, very flat. It's just a bog. You couldn't get enough water to make those towering walls that he did.
How do you respond to the fact that there are forts that sort of match the toponyms, or there are Egyptian names that match toponyms?
Well, those are New Kingdom names. So you have to have already accepted that the Exodus is happening in New Kingdom times. In Old Kingdom times, I doubt that this area was navigable. I think it was very swampy. It's very low-lying and very flat. In fact, you couldn't drown in it, no matter how hard you tried.